In 40 years, they built more churches in Germany than in 400 years.
They talk about that, whatever that number is, 700 or 800 churches that were damaged during the war. A lot of those churches, the only damage was that the windows were blown out.
With hundreds of damaged churches needing rebuilding and hundreds of new churches being built, there was plenty of work for German stained glass artists after the war. 7 of them, in particular, are considered to have been groundbreaking and widely influential.
They radically changed the stained glass world, and that's quite enough when you think about these people reinvented a 1,000-year-old art form, and they literally did. You know, after 2 world wars, there was definitely, I think, an attitude in Germany, especially for change, and people were very open and welcome to the idea of doing something that would have been completely unheard of, you know, in just a few years before the war.
The real beginnings of contemporary German stained glass can be traced back well before World War II, to 1911, and an artist who turned his back on stained glass traditions.
Ton Pricker was Dutch. He moved in 1904 to Germany. The monumental stained glass window in Hagen railway station was one of his first works. It's called The Artist as a Teacher for Crafts, Industries and Trade. And this theme was not only the motto of the German Werkbund, which was a predecessor of the Bauhaus, but it was as well the role Ton Pricker wanted to assume for himself as an artist. It shows the various industries of the Hagen area, which is coal mining, steelworking, farming, but as well tourism, ski tourism. And in the center of the window, you see the artist who is inspiring for all of these trades and these industries.
I mean, that created a big uproar, but actually was the foundation for a different thinking. To put in this sentence, that was the revolutionary part. I'm not talking about the design per se. I'm just talking about the sentence that was the revolutionary part. You know, because the artist as a teacher of the industry and the trades, come on.
During the next 20 years, he taught at different art schools and academies in Germany. He created more than 100 windows in Germany and the Netherlands. And many famous artists had been his students. Heinrich Campendonck, for example, Josef Albers, Helmut Macke, which was the cousin of August Macke, Heinrich Diekmann, Anton Wendling, Hein Derricks. And a lot more of younger artists were influenced by him, stained glass artists as Georg Meistermann, for example. Ton Pricker was a child of his time, and his time was the time of Art Nouveau, of the arts and crafts movement. Since 1912, he started designing mosaic, and later in Düsseldorf, he even had his own workshop for mosaics and stained glass.
His early windows, like the Hagen railway station, were traditional in the sense that they featured the interaction of posed figures. Over the next 12 years, Ton Pricker moved away from that tradition, as he had been influenced and emboldened by the modern art movements of the early 20th century.
His use of the line is crucial to understanding his work, because in his works the line is oscillating between referring to nature and being abstract.
I think one of my very favorite projects is Ton Pricker's at St. Georg in Cologne. Those figure windows. I can remember when I was over there, I couldn't photograph them because I just had tears just rolling in my eyes.
St. George is defined from the elbows up and is otherwise indistinct, except for a boot at the bottom of the window. His facial features are sketchy, but he is clearly plunging a spear at the dragon below. Symbols are overlaid on the design in a collage fashion, and the letters G-E-O-R-G are centered in the window. The borders of the window are reminiscent of stonework and provide a connection to the fabric of the building, but also create a portal effect to a warm interior in which the saint is seen.
Ton Pricker loved using symbols, and his figures, the saints, for example, are symbols as well. The interaction between the decoration and the room it was made for, they're very important for Ton Pricker, because his idea was the Gesamtkunstwerk, with the stained glass window, the murals or mosaics, as one part of it.
The Resurrection Church in Essen was built in 1929 and was one of Tornpricker's last commissions. Tornpricker used a subdued ornamental design for the upper levels, sometimes punctuated by Christian symbols and letters. His main aim was to filter and control the light entering the church, and he was thinking architecturally rather than trying to make an artistic statement. The feature window is in an adjoining space, partly obscured from the congregation. It is a large triptych that contains a central figure of Jesus with loaves and fishes, along with ornamental elements, religious symbols, and disembodied faces. The windows are made up of smaller self-contained images with few common lines. Apart from the text in the lowest row, the right window is a mirror image of the left window. Viewed here in early summer, the semi-transparent windows are tinted green by the leaves outside.
He really liberated glass from the traditional sort of way of dealing with color and dealing with the leadline. And everybody sooner or later had to see his work or was influenced by his work.
At first sight, it seems to be an abstract artwork. It isn't abstract. It is a detail taken out of its context. And the context was a larger window in the chapel of the girls' school Beate Maria Virginis in the city of Essen.
In a period of less than 20 years, Tornpricker moved from traditional imagery to abstraction and symbolism. He also drew attention to lead as a graphic element. It no longer needed to be disguised amongst the painted glasswork. As he moved from Art Nouveau to Art Deco, line and form became more important than detail. His idea of making the window relevant to the architecture, environment, and the purpose of the building was a principle that was picked up on by all the major glass artists who followed.
Artists who worked with him then went on and they then had their own apprentices and disciples. It was passed down from Tornpricker to Campendonk to Wendling to Schaffrath. That direct continuity was extremely important. If he had remained a painter and he had not moved to Germany, then you would not have had that. Campendonk, I think, is really not understood very much at all and not recognized, and yet I still think that he's very, very important. He took some aspects of Tornpricker's work and really, really refined it. For example, his use of glass paint by rubbing it onto the texture of an antique glass and then removing it, which really highlighted the striations and the air bubbles and gave the glass a very different kind of look. It really emphasized the textural qualities and took those textural qualities and made them two-dimensional. It was effective in softening the light as well. His linear graphic work was so precise and it was very controlled and very rigorous. There was nothing casual about any of his line compositions. You couldn't move one line in any of his compositions without throwing the whole thing off balance. He came at a period when the Nazis were just coming into power. He left Germany and there weren't very many commissions. Even after the war was over and he came back.
Anton Wendling was a high-profile student of Tornpricker, and his work straddled both world wars.
He had a phenomenal compositional sensitivity. There's a very strong sense of balance and order.
In these pre-war windows, the saints carry religious symbols that are commonly associated with them. John, in the center for example, is typically depicted holding a chalice with a snake in it. This refers to a time when he reputedly drank from a poisoned cup and did not die. One of Wendling's early post-war commissions was this tall window over the entry to the Franciscan church of Mönchengladbach. The symbols are now less visible, but they have become more ornamental and repetitive. In the side chapel there are two smaller memorial windows, in traditional reds and blues with cross motifs. From the outside of Aachen Cathedral, it can be seen that there are huge windows about 5 stories high. These were glazed by Wendling in 1952.
The thing I think in his repetition of pattern is to really understand the effectiveness of that, you really have to be in that space. To me, it's almost as though it's like a meditation. It's like a prayer. It's a very slow repetition. And you can feel yourself just beginning to just kind of settle down. There's not an anxiety about a composition. It's really about resolution and the repetition, which is really, it's almost like kind of like a mantra in a meditation.
Leading the post-war boom was an artist whose outstanding work would give a major impetus to redefining architectural stained glass.
Georg Meistermann was forbidden by the Nazis to paint. He was actually, when he wanted to paint, he was in a monastery and he was hiding away for years and years.
His work was condemned by the Nazi regime, and his studio and all his early works were burned. And he was recruited into the army, but he was a conscientious objector, so he spent the war peeling potatoes.
The Nazis labeled modern artists as degenerates, derided them in an exhibition, and banned them and their work altogether. This, of course, included Meistermann. A self-portrait secretly painted during the war shows Meistermann in a confusing limbo. His eyes are empty and his frustration with confinement is evident. He's holding a plumb bob as if to try to gain some equilibrium. Meistermann was a strongly opinionated man, especially when it came to the Nazis and the Catholic Church. He was incensed by what the Nazis had done to Germany and to Europe, and felt that the Catholic Church should have shown more opposition to them at the time. Meistermann had a fondness for the town of Wittlich in the Mosel wine-growing area, and his first major post-war commission was to design a complete set of windows for the St. Marcus Church in the center of town. He began with the choir windows. On the left he featured Mary with a young Jesus, and on the other side Mary with the 12 disciples. He also took the form of the ceiling and inverted it, and turned it into a repeated motif for the extreme left and right windows. Meistermann gave Mary a black face to show that she was not a white, blue-eyed Aryan. Black Madonnas are not uncommon, but the church refused to pay Meistermann until he gave Mary a pale face. He reluctantly changed out the glass, but after he was paid in full, he slipped back into the church and darkened her face again.
Meistermann was not a man who actually was much in favor of the Catholic Church. He was a Christian, but not necessarily organized religion.
He had a lot of cynicism in almost all forms of government and religious organizations.
The central choir window shows the resurrection of Jesus, notable for his robe, which appears to be fluttering in the breeze. It's the first sign that Meistermann was interested in depicting movement in his windows. It was not a new concept. There are many traditional windows that show movement or stopped action. But what Meistermann was about to do with movement in the coming 10 years was unprecedented. And this was just the first glimpse of it.
One of the first buildings that was built was the new radio station in Cologne, new contemporary building, which had a gigantic staircase in the center of it, and he was asked to design these glass walls. When you go there, like I've seen it, 30 years later or so, then you realize the amazing vitality of this work and the joyfulness and this breath of fresh air. You can see that he was filled with hope, and that's how it was perceived by all the other artists who actually went to see it later on.
And again, a lot of people at that time thought he's totally crazy to do that.
Meistermann wanted to abstractly depict the energy of music and the power of radio transmission, and, every so often, there is an almost recognizable object such as a stringed instrument or a transmitting device. The windows are alive with movement. They are almost chaotic. It is the lines, rather than the colors, that provide the energy. The old village town hall has been turned into a museum, housing works by Meisterman and hosting exhibitions by guest artists. These two Meisterman windows show him further exploring the power of rhythm and repetition. The museum is mostly known for being the home of his 4 powerful anti-war windows.
The 4 horsemen of the apocalypse are created by Meisterman in 1954. The first is the Victory Man, who starts with the apocalyptic time. And for Meisterman, this first horseman was as well the horseman who has started with the apocalyptic Nazi regime in Germany. All these leaders who enter into a city who are the winner of the war, they will bring somehow peace and somehow death. It can be as well a new Nero, a new Stalin, a new Hitler, a new dictator who is taking over power of a city or of an area. And the second horseman represents the horseman of the war and the civil war, that everyone will kill each other. And if some people have survived, they will be killed by the third horseman, by the horseman who is responsible for hunger. And if after the third horseman some people will live, they will be killed definitely, and all of them, by the fourth horseman of the death. The fourth window is showing the scene of Wittlich, when Wittlich was bombed by the Allies in December of 1944. Meisterman wanted to show with this window that the war has been caused by Adolf Hitler and the majority of the Germans who have voted for Adolf Hitler.
In the 1950s, architect Rudolf Schwarz designed a church where the ground plan is in the shape of a parabola, whose arms widen out to infinity. Schwarz's original blueprint had a radiating circular design in that window, but Meisterman convinced him that there is another form that, like a parabola, also reaches out to infinity.
Meisterman decided to work with a spiral form to show, like the concept of the Bible, of Alpha and Omega, that everything comes from the earth and the cosmos to God, and from God coming all the things to the cosmos. Meisterman used the 3 primary colors, blue, red and yellow, as a symbol: blue for God the Father, red for his Son, and yellow for the Holy Spirit and his influence to every spiritual things.
I had seen it in publications. It never occurred to me how big this was. The first time I saw it, I was overwhelmed. It was gigantic.
It was really revolutionary at the time, because Meisterman precedes most of the other designers by half a generation. He was much older.
He was a Christian, so he believed in all these stories, and he believed in the teachings of them, and also how he could interpret it and sort of pass it on to others.
There's a lot going on in any one of his compositions, and it's not something that you can just look at and dismiss. I mean, if you're an artist, you just keep getting drawn in more and more and more. The windows at St. Florian were very unusual in that they all had a very painterly quality as opposed to architectural quality to them.
Here he comes in and does one kind of window here, one kind of window there, another thing here, very provocatively.
The backgrounds are very dark, very, very dense. Some very, very rich colors, especially some of his purples and his deep reds. And then the figures are almost in, whites and clears, which emphasize the linear quality. Meistermann's use of painting is really beautiful. It's very lyrical. It's very minimalist. There's not a stroke that is unnecessary.
The Impressionists were interested in juxtaposing many colors together to make one color. Meistermann was interested in doing that in glass. Many of those little pieces, they make his windows scintillate.
The Pietà window is just a marvelous color composition. When you look at it, it's got that very, very dark top and then those very soft colors down below.
He's almost intentionally blocking out the light.
I think he thought of his windows as drawings first, whereas if you look back in history, everyone has been basically trying to hide the lead line. What was behind the lead line or between the lead line was the important part of the window. But in Meistermann's work, there were lines that came in. And they may have represented something, but there was graphic stuff going on there, graphics meaning drawing. Meistermann seemed like a big giant in the background. You know, they owed him so much because the jump between Thorn-Pricker and him was large.
The sense of movement in these two windows makes them especially dramatic. The left window has a triangular composition to the lines of movement, and the repetition of the lines adds to the strength of the movement.
These double lines, triple lines, 4 lines next to each other, which are almost like the shadow of a shadow of a shadow, and you don't exactly know what you're looking at, and all of a sudden it creates this depth. He was really, really ahead of his time. Luckily, we had him, and it always needs sort of people who dare do something entirely different. He influenced a lot of people.
Meistermann was very aware of transparency and translucency in nature, and was particularly interested in leaves and the light that shines through them. Each one is different, like fingerprints, and to him, the leaf became a symbol of the uniqueness of the individual.
Once I visited the crypta of St. Vitus in Mönchengladbach with my grandfather, and he jumped around like a little child. He was very convinced about his work because he said it's free and independent work, it's pure artwork. He was so happy that his work was a combination of drawings and painting works, and he was totally convinced that he has developed an absolutely free and independent style. He has chosen and selected, in the end, all the colors of a rainbow. In Sangerion, Meistermann fulfilled, as he said, his most important life work and as well his testament for his religious convictions. Münster is one of the last works of Meistermann. He said, well, this is a result of a man who has become very old and will realize that life deals all the time with death. And as you can see in my windows, I've chosen dark colors to show the influence of death, and of course bright colors and colorful colors to show power and the capacity of the love of God to fulfill us.
Meistermann had a studio in a village in the Eifel region, and he would often gaze out at the birds, watching them landing and taking off, and he envied their ability to fly. He was fascinated by the buzzards in particular, and how when the wind was just right, they could hover in one place, hardly moving. He found a spiritual metaphor in this act of hovering or levitation. The symbol indicates that not only is something in the air, but also in transition. Over 22 years, he used variations of the symbol in paintings and stained glass, and it even appears on the Meisterman family grave.
The picture of Daniel and the lions is a very typical picture from Meisterman. This picture shows purely his own conception of life, that if you have a conviction, you must be able to live, fight or die for it.
After the war, he became a very famous German artist because he was a ferocious fighter for the freedom of expression and artistic freedom.
Meisterman was convinced that you have to decide as an artist and as well as a political person. And somehow it's a biographical picture of his own life. In the face, in the head of Daniel, you can recognize as well the typical forms which belongs to Meisterman. And this is another hint how Meisterman liked to play with autobiographical hints and links just to show other people, in the end, I'm telling about myself.
Ludwig Schoefrat's early work was very influenced by Anton Wendling, for whom he worked as a teaching assistant. One of his early commissions was for the windows in the choir of this Jülich church, which are based on a repeated motif, very much in the style of Wendling. While still working for Wendling, he designed these choir windows for a church in his hometown. At first glance, these designs appear to contain a repeated symbol, but the apparent symmetry is lost as soon as the rounded components are compared to each other. He had learned from Wendling that repetition increases impact, but was now experimenting with variations on a theme. These concepts of repetition and variation would underpin his work for much of his life. His windows in a side chapel at Aachen Cathedral were the first of 3 times the cathedral commissioned work from him. Schoefrat was, by now, no longer working for Wendling, and was experimenting with ideas. He was trying to develop his own visual language, and later said it took him a lot of strength to break away from Wendling's influence. In the early 1960s, Schoefrat was commissioned to design 32 windows for the cloisters at Aachen Cathedral. The cloisters are a covered walkway surrounding a courtyard which had, in previous centuries, been the burial ground for various church dignitaries. Schoefrat considered death and burial to be the context for the windows, and designed them as memorials or epitaphs.
Those cloister windows are absolutely groundbreaking. He was among the first to use lead in such a marvelously varied way, to use a great variety of lead widths in his work, and to really explore the possibilities for lead.
It was like skeletons. It was using the lead line in a way that was like a pencil point or an ink line.
They're marvelously free-form, not random in any way, but they're not lines that you would make with drafting tools. they're drawn lines.
It was the first time where I really understood how powerful the absence of color could be, how the lines and textures really were given another dimension when there were elements that were beyond them. And it compressed those things together, and it became a different kind of abstraction. It became a dimensional abstraction that changed as you changed in your viewing perspective. That was an incredibly powerful lesson. The relationship of those windows to those stoned walls was absolutely gorgeous.
Each of them is like so well balanced, has so much character. They're all different. And you're just in presence of this huge force, this army.
"15 years after installing his first 2 choir windows at St. Maria, he was commissioned to design the remaining windows in the church.
Schoefrat approached each situation in a different way according to the context. And if it was a context that to him was somehow asking for a simple modulation of the light and not a lot of meaning, that's what he would provide.
He really didn't want to have the parishioners of the church feel like they needed to get the window or they needed to understand whatever story was in the narrative. And he felt that part of his job was to create a space for quiet, meditative, contemplative thought. He said something about being a bricklayer in glass, and to some extent he was talking about continuing the geometry of the architecture. If there was a block wall or a brick wall or some sort of pattern in the other materials in the church, he said literally, I just continued that pattern into my windows. He thought that as a bricklayer in glass, he wasn't really involving himself in a narrative. He was just basically creating a spectacular way for light to enter a sacred space.
And frequently within one church, you'll see different attitudes simply because a window was facing a different way, or its relationship to the service was different, or the architecture was different.
For example, near the baptismal font in this church, Schuffrath uses blue colors and a horizon line to suggest water. The top section of the window could be seen as a side view of falling droplets of water, and the lower section as if looking down onto ripples in water. Schuffrath does not want his window designs to be fully understood or completely known, so other lines in this composition detract from the imagery while adding interest to the design. If we take some of the lines away in the top right section, the composition becomes bottom-heavy, and that lone piece of green at the bottom, if we turn it blue, then the window is too monochromatic. More important for Schuffrath is that the forms and lines and colors are in balance. So why would he use green and not red or orange or yellow? It's because green is a secondary color made up of the primary colors blue and yellow. Since green contains blue, it is therefore harmonious. Purple is also a secondary color made from blue and red, which would be why Schuffrath made the 6 small bubble shapes purple. There is a concentric echo of the ripple on the left side of the window, and if we remove that small curved line, the composition again feels out of balance. The left side then seems too layered and structured. Throughout the 1970s, Schuffrath designed many windows with swooping parallel lines and restrained colors. The parallel lines became a signature of his work and were picked up and copied by many of his students, especially once he started giving workshops around the world. The cemetery chapel at Scherpenzeel is small, and Schuffrath's window takes up the whole back wall. Schuffrath would absolutely have known that there would be a casket in front of the window while it was being viewed, and once we digitally add a casket, we can see how it becomes part of the design. Decades later, this work remains one of his most enigmatic designs. Like many of the best contemporary windows, it offers no definite answers, but invites viewers to add their own interpretation or spiritual insight.
Schuffrath can often deal very nicely thematically with the location where his windows are, like in the swimming pool in Ubach, Pallenberg, where you have those big sweeping wave things. There's definitely the allusion to water there.
In the early 80s, Schuffrath said that if you showed him photographs of 12 windows and of 12 buildings, he should be able to tell which window went with each building. It was certainly true of the swimming pool window, but as with many of his quotes, it does not apply to all of his work over time. His thoughts about glass changed as he developed and matured. Schuffrath designed all the windows for St. Lucia in a period from 1970 through to 1995. So there are a variety of styles. At one time, when the church's finances were low, he even designed this simple window to suit their budget. He designed the whole interior, which meant he not only climbed up scaffolding to paint the ceiling himself, but also created the large mosaic altarpiece, brass chalices, and a lid for the baptismal font.
St. Joseph's is completely amazing because it's so different from what you think of as stained glass.
St. Joseph was a working church when Schuffrath designed and installed his windows in the 70s. In 2006, it was converted to a mausoleum and now houses small urns containing the ashes of those who have passed on.
I'm not even a spiritual person, but it became a very spiritual thing to go into that church. The whole thing gave me goosebumps. It was the most atmospheric I've ever seen, I think.
It was just an experience of feeling the passage of time, because all the imagery there in the boat and the stream, in the windows, they have this reference to transition.
I think basically it was going up the way Shafrat's work tends to do, but it was interfered with by these somewhat Baroque shapes around the edge. So when you looked at the window, you didn't see squares or rectangles. You saw these shapes moving in and out, and some of those shapes wound up twisting into some of the parallel lines that he used.
The building is now a quiet, solemn place where the windows stand in silence. But for 40 years they were a visual accompaniment to the church services, and accompanied by choirs and organ music would have been experienced quite differently. The last window installed was designed as a labyrinth and helps us understand that the St. Joseph windows are about pathways and journeys. There are thousands of labyrinths around the world, usually attached to or inside of churches. The most famous is in the great medieval cathedral at Chartres. Many people like to use a labyrinth to get over some problem or issue. They meditate upon it along the path and then pause at the center and, symbolically, leave the issue there behind them as they move on out. It is somehow typical of Shafrat's wry sense of humor that the path on his labyrinth does not go into the center, but skirts around it on all sides. In 2006, at the age of 81, Shafrat designed a set of dark and somber windows for the choir of St. Joseph's to complete the full cycle. It wasn't until late 2016, 5 years after his death, that funds were raised and the windows were finally fabricated and installed.
One of the techniques he used was to use a crayon on its side and to make big sweeping arcs with the crayon, bold forms, and then he would fill in with a pencil or a pen, smaller forms and lines. He was very interested in form. He felt that a window or a drawing, above all, had to have a strong form. He also liked hierarchy, so he liked secondary and tertiary lines and forms within a drawing.
He began to talk a lot about this idea of architectural art and how important it was to him that his work be compatible with and a part of the architecture and not play the traditional role of helping teach biblical narratives to the parishioners. And in the modern world, he wanted to kind of help churchgoers. He wanted to help them feel like their worship could be modern.
Aachen Cathedral is over 1,200 years old and was Germany's first UNESCO World Heritage Site. It was constructed by Emperor Charlemagne, and more than 40 German kings and queens were crowned on the simple throne made with marble from Palestine. Such was Shafrat's standing in Aachen, that his 3 children were baptized on that same throne. The entry windows commemorate a pilgrimage that Charlemagne undertook to the shrine of St. James the Great in Santiago, navigating by the stars of the Milky Way.
while you're creating a work, there are different periods of your exposure to what you're doing. There's that time when you're looking at it a foot away and you're at, a table, and then you blow it up to large size and still, it's two-dimensional and there's not a lot of color in there, and, it's a graphic exercise and you get to know it that way. And then you get to know it while it's on the tables and there are a bunch of pieces around and the materials have a different kind of quality. And then you get it into an opening and you have light coming through it and it's in a volume and it's in a space and it's totally a different experience. And the point of this is that you have to have that full range of experience, from that very tight, confined, focused detail at the beginning, working through the immediacy of the materials, and then to see what happens as the end result. What I learned was that once you have that last experience in a volume, in a space, you begin to understand how things that you do in the beginning when you're on a graphic table will translate and have an effect in the actual space. So you begin to think about that while you're composing, and it goes beyond just a graphic exercise.
The balance that he created with those colored forms in the windows tended to sort of balance out the rest of the building, which is very much like, I think, being a player in an orchestra or a member of the band.
Schafferot's studio has been left the way it was when he died. His tools and materials cover the benches, and glass samples line up along the windows. Some of the hangings are reminders of his fascination in later life with circular forms and the ways they can be divided up internally. An adjacent workspace houses raw materials for his mosaic work, and large circular mosaics line up along a studio wall. Panels from his last exhibition pay homage to artists he admired, such as Torn Pricker, Wendling, Frank Lloyd Wright, and Antoni Gaudí. His final exhibition panel is named Epitaph and was fabricated after his death. St. Fowelin Church is next to the Aachen Cathedral and features some of Buchholz's early abstract windows. In the 70s, Buchholz developed two distinct design styles. His colorful organic work is what he is mostly known for, and Corneli Minster shows early windows in this style. At St. Vitus, his windows are along the sides of the church, where their main purpose is to provide light rather than be objects of study. From this time, Buchholz used colorful figurative designs in areas of contemplation and used clear or lightly colored glass for areas of transition. Although these windows have a geometric pattern, they are hand-drawn, so each line and shape has an individual quality. Below Meisterman's windows at St. Gerrian, there's a gallery of colorful windows by Buchholter, which unfortunately are mostly hidden by architectural details. His concrete and glass windows near the entry are more accessible and contain protruding glass rods of different diameters, as well as sections of cast glass. Buchholter designed all 51 windows at St. Clara. The windows down the aisles of the church are muted and restrained, so that they do not fight for attention with the content of the choir windows. The choir windows are the focal point and colorfully illustrate Bible stories. The upper left window shows a rooster up in the rosette, and Jesus on the cross with the sun above him in the eclipse. In the lower left corner, Judas is depicted with his pieces of silver. The middle window shows a shaft of sunlight lighting the empty tomb, which is covered with a shroud, and there's an angel in the background. The right window shows the morning star on Easter morning, and a throne along with 12 gates into heavenly Jerusalem. The lower left window features Adam and Eve's expulsion from paradise. The middle window has a fire breaking out, and the right window has an angel bringing fire to earth. So, in the figure windows, Buchholter has continued the age-old practice of illustrating events from the Bible, but he does it in a modern, abstracted way. The last of his windows is not constructed in the traditional method of using lead to connect small pieces of glass together. Instead, it is made up of 3 large pieces of clear window glass, which have been screen printed with traditional glass paint and fired in a kiln. In the St. Agnes Church in Cologne, he is using the thinnest lead possible, so as not to emphasize edges, but to leave the focus on shapes and colors. Buchholter was a watercolorist, and most of his initial designs were done as watercolors. A common watercolor technique is to leave a little white paper between the colored shapes to help them stand apart. Buchholter does the same in these windows, so that they are not completely full of dense edge-to-edge color. In his later years, Buchholter sometimes eliminated lead completely and painted directly on large pieces of white glass, using glass enamel paints, which were then fired onto the glass. When Joachim Close left art school, he was a young man adept at woodcuts, etchings, screen printing, and other methods of applying paint to a surface. He was a painter through and through. So when he started working with glass, he immediately saw it as a surface to be painted on. He spent much of his childhood in the forests of Thuringia, where he was impacted by the fractured light filtering through the trees. This influenced his approach to his first major commission at the Church of St. Mary's Ascension. Close saw the world as jagged, irrational, and imperfect, and wanted no regularity in the windows. He disguised the regular lead strips by painting the glass alongside them. This can be seen in the 2 small panels he produced for the church, where the painted surfaces of the glass can clearly be seen around the lead strips. The church was not quite ready for a Mary with a blue face, or a Jesus with a green face, so these panels were rejected and are now museum pieces. The small, powerful windows in this church reference mankind's inhumanity and were created in the late 60s when there were events like the Kennedy assassinations, the murder of Martin Luther King, the famine in Biafra, the Cold War, and the Vietnam War. It is probable the windows will always be relevant as, unfortunately, there are always wars and tragedies.
They were windows that were basically supposed to be looked at from a very close distance, because it's like so much was happening in the glass. And the intensity of the imagery combined with a very, very austere palette really grabs you. There is one window that has a brazen window in it, but as you get closer to it, you'll see the nails that are sticking out from the window. And those are not painted nails, it's metal.
In this commission, Close began using flashed glass. Flashed glass has a base color with a thin film of second color on top of it. The flashed layer is masked with an adhesive resist, and the desired pattern is cut out of it. Hydrofluoric acid is then used to dissolve the flash layer through the cutouts, so that the base color can show through in those areas. The same effect can be achieved by sandblasting the flashed layer away. The masking is removed and the glass is ready for use. The main benefit of this method is being able to have adjacent colors without a dark lead line between them, but it also enables finer detail. In the destroyed temple, there are themes that carry through much of Close's later works. First, there's the rainbow, symbolizing hope. Next to it is a perspective view of old and ornate architecture and, at the bottom, the arm of a person holding a dagger behind their back. The design is an early example of Close's collage approach to composition.
After you look at all the windows on the first tier and then you look up, there are very abstract windows on the second layer that are using like curves and very bright colors. And that kind of gives a consolation that there is more to it. There's also another window that it's like a sculptural installation, and it's by the altar, and it's made out of protruding sticks of glass of a different length. And that is also a very powerful piece because it works with all this theme of violence on one hand, and on another hand, it's like absolutely beautiful and gorgeous to look at.
When Close first visited the St. Nicholas Church, it was empty, and he was struck by the contrast between the clean white Gothic arches and the ornate Baroque organ. He saw the juxtaposition of two styles as quite jarring, but since he had long favored the interaction of contradictory elements, he decided to use incongruity as the theme for his windows.
Because of his genius, he made it work. I mean, it could have been a total disaster, but he actually It was joyful, it was playful, it was invigorating, it was, it was really beautiful work. The way he designed was to use elements from woodcuts and then have a very organized background like a grid or something that would stabilize the picture, and then threw in all kinds of unexpected elements.
At the bottom of one window, there appears the head and shoulders of a young girl who is split down the middle and moved apart to allow for the vertical framing. Most artists would be inclined to place the girl somewhere in the design where she could be intact, but Close not only puts her in an awkward place, but deliberately confounds perspective further by having a huge space between her eyes and between her hand and her fingertips. And then he accentuates the distortion by inserting vertical strips of glass to widen the gap further.
It's very tall, clear windows, and they have a border of a yellow glass around them. And then the imagery that is in the windows, it's kind of split between some images at the top and various ways of how that path of imagery is coming to the bottom portion of it. That particular church was dedicated to healing illness, like helping people to heal their wounds, whatever they are, like physical or emotional. The effect of this yellow glass around the windows was absolutely amazing. It was like healing light coming through it. And what was very cool about those windows, that there was a lot of open space in them. He touched many themes there in the windows. There also were a lot of rainbow colors, but used very sparingly.
His designs were very organized in patterns. He was fascinated with patterns, I think, and that grid work was a very strong, actually, part of the design.
The theme of these windows is vocation. Each of the windows features biblical personalities who had a calling or life mission.
Paintings he did of St. Paul falling off of his horse, the most beautiful horse, but of course it was combined with a wonderful layer of all kinds of geometry. And then the fallen Paul really looked like a big kind of dough head. It was quite extraordinary how he had brought all of the incredible drawing skills to the horse, but left St. Paul on the ground looking really like a dummy. A big stone head. It's outrageous.
From the late 70s onwards, Close moved away from semi-figurative biblical narratives to freer, more abstract compositions.
He was always one of Punskin's favorites, and so Punskin talked about him a lot. And I think Shafrat also respected his work a great deal. Although it would be hard to find two artists that were more different than Shafrat and Close.
Close had a special relationship with the Mönchengladbach Church. His first commissions happened there in 1959, and in 2000 he designed windows for the porch. His grids were still prominent, but there is much more light coming through the windows compared to his earlier work. The clear textured glass made the windows more membrane-like and allowed the outside view to be included. In these windows, Close is using flashed glass more and more.
the importance of establishing a gridwork in lines before you even begin to put the dynamic lyrical lines in your design. So that if you want a great massive area of a single color, the grid lines become they're static lines. They're just vertical or horizontal, and the eye doesn't pay attention to them. The eye pays attention to the dynamic lines or the lyrical lines in the design.
Hubert Spierling is possibly the least understood and least emulated of the contemporary German stained glass designers. His approach was not to be overly impactful upon the architecture, to quietly take his place with respect to the building, but, more importantly to him, with respect to the light. The large windows at St. Rochus could have easily become overpowering if the design had been more intense. He chose, instead, an overall cool color, and as with all of his windows, avoided any regularity or pattern. The design is amorphous and not attention-seeking. Most of the lines in the windows are horizontal or vertical, contributing to the feeling of stability. There are some small windows at eye level, and they are more colorful and formal. Since the name of the church is Saint Maria, Spierling's windows feature scenes from the life of Mary. Most of them are figurative and have pale glass borders, which give them a floating effect. Spierling achieves harmony and uniformity in the designs by making the painted lines the same width as the lead lines. The window in the organ gallery is described as a free composition, but since it features 12 yellow shapes, it could be interpreted as the 12 years that Mary spent in the temple. It could represent the 12 disciples, the Last Supper, or the 12 pearly gates. The number 12 is represented 187 times in the Bible, so there are many other possible interpretations. All the windows in this modern church are abstract compositions and have not been given titles. They are mostly made with milky opaque glass and in muted pastel colors. Spierling limits the use of bold colors because he did not want his windows to be attention-seeking. It was always about what he could do with the light that comes through each window and how it affected the interior of the building. Each window design in the church is different, but they have enough similarities in colors and shapes that they obviously belong together. A common feature of Spierling's windows is to have a straight line accompanied by an informal wandering line, almost as if order sits alongside disorder. Spierling's rose window at this church appears delightfully formal and loose at the same time. Each of the 6 segments is drawn slightly different, as throughout his whole body of work, he fought against pattern, regularity, and imitation.
I was asked to design something for the south side of this church. And the church is actually just a rectangular shaped box and doesn't have any face to the road. The only window is this wall, except I think it's 3 or 4 small windows on the other side high up. I decided to first structure the site very three-dimensional and then to have dalle de verre or slab glass, as you say. Some are close to the outside and some are inside. It all changes. It has all the color, all the light, all the power on one side. Maybe I wouldn't do that today. At this time I wanted to do art. People shouldn't realize from looking at them, has the architect done it himself? That would be a compliment for me. It shouldn't look like something added to the building.
You can find a very strong thread in all of Punson's work, or not all, but in the last 30 years, there's a very strong thread in his work, which is pattern capturing light, pattern expressing light, pattern exploring light, pattern modulating light.
He has ways of layering work and using kind of the interference and refraction of and effects of light in ways that are absolutely, they're subtle and mysterious to me. I have to spend a very long time to try and figure out what Punskin is doing often.
It's all panels about this size. It's difficult to realize from outside where one panel begins and the next, due to vertical strips of concrete that makes it a little bit three-dimensional. And then they are exactly in the angle against the angle of the roof. What I always liked and still like is a field of grass and the wind. It's a regular structure, but then by wind it moves. I try to create a little bit of this more or less random movement in it.
It is kinetic, but it starts with a pattern. He has to have some sort of structure to hold the light and to play with the light. And of course there has to be a structure to just hold up the glass.
What is my final product? It's not the window, and even if it is a series of windows, it's not the series of windows, but it's what they do to the space. Or does my contribution to a building affect people emotionally? How do they feel with that? I doubt whether I would have become a good painter or sculptor, but I think I could have become an architect. It's very important to me, how does a window look from outside? It's not only from inside. And the better it looks, it becomes part of a building, of an architecture. In the case of St. Andreas in Essen, I tried to create a light that was similar to the original glass blocks, because I wanted to respect the architect's concept of the whole thing and not to make these windows too much art. It's strange for an artist. Well, what are glass blocks? They are neither transparent nor opaque. They are not transparent, but they distort the view to the outside, and by this distortion they create a brilliant light. And by not being transparent, they make users of a space feel visually protected. It's sort of a wall and not of a window opening. My solution for Andreas is to first divide the 5 by 5 meter units by a steel framework, and then I have singular panels of about a square meter, and to fill these square meters opening by 3 layers of glass. To the outside it's a tempered security glass that has acid etched lines, because I wanted to have the sheets of glass less shiny. The inside layer is just reeded glass, and the reeds are always parallel to the framework and to the floor. In between is a third panel, and that's the art. It is composed by a gray machine-made colored glass, no texture at all, and again reeded glass, but then in different angles. So by visually overlapping these reeds create a sort of a kinetic effect. Sometimes one corner looks a little bit green or color from the trees behind, so it visually interacts with the outside a little bit. Just enough to give the feeling of being encaged in this church. Well, we come to the question whether a complex context makes it difficult to integrate my own work. It doesn't at all. In the Hohneckirche, there are the wall paintings and given colors of the columns. So all these things, they made it really easy for me. I just had to forget myself and to answer to them. There was no question of what color I would have liked, maybe a blue or whatsoever. It wouldn't fit there. So in terms of scale, I had the painted wall tapestries. I had, in terms of colors, I had the given colors. I cannot think, if it's a medieval building, would they have liked my solution, because that's a stupid question.
He talked about visual quotation. It was just as if a musician was paying a tribute to Bach or Beethoven, and they took just a few little notes, from a symphony and placed it in the middle of a very contemporary piece of music. He put these visual quotations in his windows. It made total sense to me, and I thought it was a very respectful thing for him to do in terms of the history of the building and a way to bridge the gap.
The light is always most prominent, and he tries to make the pattern subtle. And is very successful at doing that by eliminating the structure as much as possible and having it just expose the raw edges of the glass which capture the light. He's not emphasizing the structure, he's emphasizing the light.
We artists, we shouldn't be the most important thing in an architecture. That's artist behavior, huh? Look at me.
Johannes Schreiter is more the philosopher of the whole group. Very individual work and very contemplative.
The technique of brand collage, which I found in 1959, I discovered my identity as an artist. The brand collage reflected my dark, apocalyptic mood at this time and was supported by the idea of the Cold War between East and West. But my burning marks do not solemnly express destruction. They also point to the transformation into a new, purified existence.
Johannes Schreiter's first major commission came in 1959 when he was 29 years old. Although new to stained glass, he understood instinctively that applying the colors of the timber and stonework to the window would help to integrate it. The major angular forms in the window overlap and combine in a generally upward movement.
On top of it came my own metaphysical foundation of fear. Heidegger, German philosopher, calls that the fundamental fear.
Schreiter's second commission was for St. Johannes in the small town of Kitzingen in Bavaria. Rather than create a separate design for each of the choir windows, his design spreads large shapes across all windows, giving the church a feeling of being surrounded. It feels like we're not looking at windows, but through windows. In the small chapel at Leudesdorf, the windows are the walls. While blue is a very restful color, the windows are animated by the flurry of lead lines. Most lines do not end when they meet another lead line. They somehow cross over.
In traditional stained glass, lead lines surround pieces of glass, and the idea of being able to extend the lead line beyond its functional position is a very opening kind of a thing to be able to do.
Schreiter has said in the past that in a composition, you can't have a searching color, but you can have a searching line. What he means by that is that the color serves as the foundation, the background, and the line is the component that has the expressive characteristics.
By the 1980s, he was being called upon to teach at glass design workshops around the world. After one such trip to New Zealand in 1983, He became ill for a long time and tells of returning to Germany and being healed by Jesus Christ in a religious meeting.
After 1983, there was a change into more meaningful content in my visual statements. The noticeable change was that of the colors, which became brighter. The visual language of my abstract artwork changed into three-dimensional grids, ropes, bands, and finally into handwritings, formulae, and notations.
When asked to blend with some existing plain diamond windows, Schreider reimagined the lines as nets and worked with the biblical connotations of nets and fishermen in this and a number of other churches. Often the imagery was about being liberated, no longer being constrained or trapped.
He has things in his windows that are literal. And, literally literal. He has words in windows, which other people have stopped doing since the medieval times when they did that.
Construction of the Holy Ghost Church began in 1400, and later the church housed the Bibliotheca Palatina, hundreds of manuscripts containing mankind's collective knowledge at the time. Schreider considered contemporary knowledge and updated the concept in his designs for a series of 22 windows for the church.
Each window points to a different aspect of contemporary life.
His medicine window can be read across from top to bottom like a page. The blue star signifies eternity, and the top row contains the heartbeat of an unborn child. The heartbeat continues down the window, showing us the lifespan of a person. The cross and the burning mark at the bottom row signify death and transformation back to the blue of eternity. So the window challenges us to meditate upon the brevity of our lives. The date of September 4th, 1965, is the day of the death of Albert Schweitzer, the great theologian and physician.
He made commentary about what was happening in society in these windows. They were really about expressing an idea, an observation. The windows really highlight the concept of where faith fits in our lives and the faith that our society and our culture puts in these contemporary components of our society. His way of saying things was that is the wrong place to put a faith.
The designs were too challenging for the church, and only the physics window was commissioned, and even then it was just installed as a trial window. The date at the bottom is the day the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. Einstein's physics equation is his famous theory of relativity, and the quotes at the top of the window reference biblical verses about the end of days.
While physics have done many wonderful things for our society, it still can be used and is threatened to be used to dominate other people.
In spite of the uproar about the Heidelberg designs and calls by some people to have the physics window removed, it remains in place, solitary and somewhat incongruous. It gives us a hint of what would surely have been one of the great window cycles of the 20th century.
After my designs for the Holy Ghost Church were rejected, I got an offer or an order from the scientists of the Royal London Hospital. And here a few design examples of this cycle.
Schreider made no bones about the fact that he ran a piece of plexiglass into a bandsaw and cut a slot into it and then fed the lead up in there and had no problem with it. Didn't feel like that was, cheating in terms of technique.
It was easy for him to move into plexiglass because it really followed his belief that it was the composition that was primary and it was the materials that were secondary. There really are no rules in that regard as long as you are achieving what the composition is about.
I guess we were really, really lucky in Europe that we had the Bauhaus movement before that, and the Bauhaus was sort of pretty similar to the glass studio movement later, because, you know, all these fantastic designs for Bauhaus, there were designers, and then there were people who were actually fabricating these designs.
Schreider explains that the red shapes in this window represent the wounds of Jesus when on the cross. Schreider also sees his burn marks as wounds or stigmata.
These wounds are very important. The Greek word stigma, translated, means pierced and burnt marks. And this connects with my marks in the front collage.
This was one of the first windows to feature Schreider's U-shape, a symbol which he used in many windows from then on.
It symbolizes an open hand which wants to be filled from above. These long U-shapes symbolizes not only a vessel but different life situations. When this U-form sign grows and becomes stretched arms, then it means the person stretches out for something he wants to get. He asks for something. It's the gesture of a priest when he blesses the members of a church. As well, stretched arms can be interpreted as excitement. In case of football, people raise their arms when team scores a goal.
At the Wiesbaden Town Hall, Schreider's window is in the meeting room of the town council. Some of the white squares are plain, but many are individualized by intrusions of lead and glass. Schreider says in this project, his intent was to provoke the conscience of the members of the council. To do this, he had a number of tongue-in-cheek quotes painted on the glass. He asked different people to write out these for him so that the handwriting would be different on each quote. The windows at St. Bernard in Minster were installed over a period of 20 years, so there are a variety of design styles. The earliest windows from around 1990 feature red ribbons and dark brown background drapes. The largest window was installed at the rear of the church in 1991. In 1996, the windows in the Workday Chapel by the main entrance of the church were installed and feature plain white backgrounds, allowing mostly uncolored light into the room. The dormer windows were installed in 2011 and feature some virtuoso glass cutting.
It really was only because the pioneers of the German glass movement did not think about technique. They left that completely up to the studios.
His use of color is really to create a color field, and on that field is where the composition happens.
In the chapel at the Priest's Seminary in Minster, Schreider's high row of 14 windows depict the Stations of the Cross, various stages along the path where the cross is being carried, falling, being lifted up, and carried again. At the end, there is a large resurrection window, showing Jesus rising from the grave. There is no chance or randomness in Schreider's designs. He is fastidious about every new mark, every line, every shape, every tint, and every tone.
I am interested to point it with my stained glass work to the eternal. But the eye-opener for eternal can be the internal order of a picture, because heaven's first law is order. I think that's it.
Augsburg Cathedral houses the oldest set of stained glass windows in the world, dating back to the 11th or 12th century. The theme in Schreider's triptych in the West Choir is the Second Coming, or the Return of the Kingdom of God. Back in Heidelberg, 30 years after the infamous window cycle for the Holy Ghost Church, Schreider was commissioned to design a cycle of 9 windows for the nearby St. Peter's Church. Schreider named each window as a key to its interpretation.
In one of them in particular, there's dark shapes coming into the window from the left, and those represent Nazis that actually came to this very church. On the right, they are white shapes, and 2 of them are kind of leaving the window, and the white shapes represent priests. One of the shapes, however, is turning around and facing the Nazis. And from above, a white shaft comes down, and that is a power of God that is supporting the priest.
In the Heavenly Jerusalem window, Schreider pictorializes a description from the Book of Revelations, where Heavenly Jerusalem is described as a city with 4 sides. The 12 entrances were described as being covered with precious stones and are what we commonly refer to as the pearly gates. As the name suggests, the small town of Weinsberg is in a wine-growing district. Schreider was originally called on to design a small window in the Romanesque section of the church, but was later commissioned to design the 7 windows in its East Gothic choir room. The central window is the least complex so as not to be distracting from the hanging cross. Returning to this church in his hometown of Lahnen, Schreider designed 2 windows over the entrance to the chapel.
He sort of gave the parishioners, people that saw his work there, an opportunity to feel comfortable with the modern world and with the whole idea of something being so radically new and different. And that was really needed in all of Europe after World War II.
The German pioneers of contemporary stained glass dramatically modernized the medium in individual ways. Once their work was made known, glass artists from around the world traveled to Germany to meet them and experience their work firsthand. Through design workshops in other countries, they influenced the work of hundreds of other glass artists, and many books have been written about the work they created in the 70 years after World War II.
There's no comparison to any other period in history. It wasn't a revival of anything. It was taking a very traditional, very beloved and acceptable art form and turning it on its ear.